Welcome back to Emerge, a podcast about how humanity can escape self-termination and liberate the more beautiful future our hearts tell us is possible. Before I introduce today's episode, I want to take a moment to thank the following individuals who, in an act of extreme wisdom, discernment, and compassion, have decided to become supporters of the Emerge podcast. So a shout out to Francis Lacoste, Jason Snyder, David Yoakum, and Christopher Lund. Your generosity helps keep the digital lights on, and it stokes the light of my heart. It really means a lot to me, so thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you, listener, want to make a similarly wise decision as these fine individuals, you can click the link at the bottom of the show notes of this or any other episode. Okay, so in this episode, I'm speaking once more with Jordan Greenhall. This is his third time on the show, and this time we're talking about rivalrous and anti-rivalrous dynamics, the rise of self-organizing collective intelligences, and how QAnon might be an early example of the future of collective sense-making. Please enjoy this episode of Emerge. Welcome to another episode of Emerge. This time on the show, we have back with us Jordan Greenhall. Jordan, welcome back to Emerge.
Thanks, Daniel.
And I asked Jordan to come back on the show in order to unfold what I increasingly see as an extremely important sort of conceptual framework for understanding, in my opinion, one of the most massive changes happening in our economy and in our culture and on our planet right now. And that's this distinction between rivalrous and anti-rivalrous dynamics. And Jordan is the first person I've seen to really unfold this. I think it is a kind of conceptual framework that he has created out of this source code or deep code group and analysis and conceptual scheming in order to help us make sense out of an increasingly chaotic and complex world. And so when we start to talk about things like distributed autonomous organizations or self-organizing collective intelligences or, novel forms of economic transactions and architectures like holochain, it's really helpful, I've found, to have this conception of rivalrous and anti-rivalrous dynamics kind of available to us to kind of help us make sense of why some of these innovations can be so important, so significant, and can really change the nature of the human experiment. And so, Jordan, I'm happy to have you back on the show to talk about this. And maybe we can just start by having you give a kind of overview of rivalrous and anti-rivalrous dynamics for folks who aren't familiar with the concept. And then we can kind of play with it and see how it can help us make sense of our world today.
Sure. So I was exploring some questions about, 15 years ago now, and on my own basis began to form some concepts and noticed that there was a pre-existing set of words, most notably the idea of rivalry. And then I believe Stephen Weber had coined the term anti-rivalrous to represent kind of the inverse of it, or the opposite of it. And so the framework that I'm about to give you is entirely mine. And I don't know if anybody spent any time with me, but I have more of an entrepreneurial mindset than an academic mindset. So think of this as a toolkit that is expected to be, it's like a cast iron frying pan and a skillet that's designed to do work, not necessarily be fine-tuned. So the basic idea is that it seems that there are at least two different kinds of, let's just call it phenomena in the universe that we can interact with, and most importantly, that we can share. And so the first, the rivalrous, is, for example, most canonically energy. So let's say, for example, a, a barrel of oil. And so what we notice with the barrel of oil is that if I have it, you don't have it. And if you have it, then I don't have it, right? There's a fundamental characteristic of it being rivalrous, meaning that we are rivals for possession of it. Mm. And interestingly, at the most pure version of rivalry, it is also entropic, which is to say that if I use it, it is to some degree destroyed and goes away. So as I use the oil, it evaporates from anybody being able to have access to it. And so there's a very deep connection between the idea of rivalry and the idea of scarcity, that all things that are scarce are rivalrous. And then we can take this and we can put it on a continuum. So we can notice that there are things that are ever so slightly less rivalrous, but still characteristically of that same kind. Say, for example, a car. So same thing is that if I have it, you don't have it, but we can make it bigger. We can make it a bus. And so now 30 people can share it, or an airplane, right? So we can have things that are more shareable, but still conceptually, like categorically, it's of the sort that there's something finite and bounded to its utility. And so at some limit, it is not shareable. And equally, you can have something that is more durable. So I could have a fork, and I might be able to use this fork many, many, many times before it becomes useless. But nonetheless, at the limit, it is fundamentally entropic. It is fundamentally, the use of it is destroying some of its capacity. So these are sort of the fundamental characteristics of all things rivalrous, and then we can see how certain phenomena in the world fit on that continuum.
Right. Right. And you say, I think in some of the videos I've seen of you speaking on this, that essentially all of human economic activity throughout history until quite recently has been fundamentally rivalrous in nature.
Or at least oriented towards the rivalrous is the primary question, right? So, we don't have enough food to go around is sort of the core question. And so, okay, great. Well, who gets it? That's the most important economic problem. And well, we can tell a little bit more of that story in a second. Let me tell you the anti-rivalrous side of the story, and then we can come back to the relationship between the two in economic history, if that continues to be of interest. So the anti-rivalrous is different in kind. It's a qualitatively different kind of thing. And so we can use as an example, say, well, the idea of anti-rivalrous, which is I have it, and in the process of sharing it with you, now you have it, but I haven't lost it. There's just more of it in reality. And so that's kind of the basis. That's the fundamental characteristic of the anti-rivalrous is that it's unlimited shareability. There's no point at which it is bounded in its ability to be shared. This is connected to things like zero marginal cost reproduction, which is to say all anti-rivalrous things have an asymmetric relationship between the cost of the first example, like the cost of innovation, the cost of invention from 0 to 1, and the cost of reproduction is highly asymmetric, whereas rivalrous phenomena tend to have relatively symmetric. Like if you're growing a tomato, the second tomato is more or less the same effort as the first and the third and the fifth. There's like a fixed cost to reproducing tomatoes, whereas the idea of calculus may be really, really hard, but once you've figured it out, sharing that idea might in fact be very, very easy. Not necessarily trivial, but very, very easy in comparison to the first copy. Then the second characteristic of the anti-rivalrous is that the more people who have it, the more valuable it becomes. And this is again on that notion of the continuum. So if I have something like, say, a song, it is certainly anti-rivalrous in the sense that I can know the song and you can have the song and neither of us have lost anything. But while we can see that there's something about the fact that both of us have the song that makes it at least potentially more valuable. Say, for example, we can both sing it together. Or you could do a remix of the song and that remix then generates something of value to me because I can recognize it not just as a new song, but as a remix. As you go further down the continuum, you start ending up with things like, say, language, where language is the essence of that thing called Metcalfe's law, or the network effect, where, in point of fact, every single additional person who has a capacity, who understands the language, makes the language more valuable. Everybody who is connected to a communications network makes the communications network more valuable and on a faster than linear growth rate.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the two basic territories. And so going back to the historical record, the connection between the anti-rivalrous and communication is pretty fundamental. And so if you look at evolutionary history, you have energetic exchange and you have communication exchange. And they've been running on different paths. So energetic exchange is ancient. And it's certainly as ancient as all biological life. Like that's just foundational. And energetic exchange is fundamentally rivalrous. And the entire driver around evolution is about the conflict or the effort to maximally access the fundamentally rivalrous resources that happen to be in a given niche. And so that's a very long story. Now, embedded in that story, there is the communication exchange, the anti-rivalrous almost discoveries that show up in the evolutionary story. The ability, for example, to just at a high level, being able to perceive something rather than having to encounter it directly is something that is going more in the direction of communication, more in the direction of information. But now if I can communicate that, so if I could see a potential predator and then turn to you and communicate the existence of that potential predator, that's something that's happening in the anti-rivalrous domain that is impacting and affecting this evolutionary rivalrous substrate. And so now if we start running the film forward, what we begin to see is that this exponential or this faster than linear feedback that happens in the anti-rivalrous domain has been a primary driver of the course of evolution and building neural cells that could perceive information and simulate the environment without taking an energetic cost, but actually run it in the information domain, building the capacity to generate and perceive signals, vocalizations or noises that could then be used to share information about the environment in the anti-rivalrous domain, et cetera, right? Until as we move further and further, humans writing, the printing press, you just sort of see a continuing ramifying effect of what gets built on top of something which doesn't go away once it's discovered, or at least is largely preserved once it's discovered, is easily shareable, and therefore becomes a substrate. You don't have to reproduce it every time. And how that drives a curve. In fact, it drives the curve, like the famous singularity curve of Kurzweil is driven by this fact, by the dynamics of the anti-rivalrous in relationship to the fundamentally rivalrous energetic substrate of lived reality.
Okay, so we've kind of set up this distinction between these two types of phenomena, as you say. And one of the things that was really striking to me as I was researching ahead of this conversation was in your YouTube video where you kind of present this sort of distinction. You say that this might be one of, if not the most important conceptual frameworks to have at our disposal right now. And, there's a way in which, yes, we can observe rivalrous and anti-rivalrous dynamics throughout history, but there is some kind of, phase shift or transition that's happening. And I'm curious how you would position us now in this kind of arc of history and dialectic between rivalrous and anti-rivalrous, or relationship between the two phenomena. Like, what's happening now that is so significant? And how does this distinction help us make sense of it?
Yeah, it's at a kind of a concrete level. It seems that there's something fundamental, like a gateway in the area that's called information technology, computation, going from analog to digital, computer science, like a science that actually understands and studies information in its most fundamental form, all of these things are, frankly, late 20th century things. They happened only in the past couple of generations. And this is the first time that there's been an ability to both perceive and act on and through something that is very, very purely anti-rivalrous. And to begin the process of actually grasping, both conceptually and practically, this exponential or this quadratic character. I'm going to use the word exponential. I know that it's not specific, but it's so much part of the common parlance. We'll just use it as almost a neologism to represent the curve of the anti-rivalrous. And so I'll give you an example of how this has shown up concretely. There was a time when entrepreneurship was like opening up a pizza shop or a gas station. And this kind of entrepreneurship showed up in what you might call the energetic or the linear economy, that you could be successful and you may even have lots of customers. But there's something different about that and, say, Microsoft or Facebook. And if you look and think about entrepreneurship now, it's almost completely remapped to the subset technology entrepreneur. And in fact, technology entrepreneur is almost completely mapped to the subset of what you might call anti-rivalrous entrepreneur, which are these particular activities like Facebook and Uber and WhatsApp, where the thing that is being worked on is specifically as far along the anti-rivalrous continuum as can be identified, because that's where the leverage is. If you can figure out a way to build and own something that is deeply anti-rivalrous, then you're writing that Metcalfe's law. You're writing that exponential growth curve, which is just vastly higher returns on capital than can be gotten through the sort of ordinary slugging of old-fashioned energetic materials entrepreneurship. And the point is that this is conscious. This is not a mystery. There's awareness in the Silicon Valley. There's awareness in business schools that this is the case. So we've moved from the unconscious and what might you say, hesitant, tentative, and largely accidental discovery of the effect of the anti-rivalrous in the evolutionary game over billions of years, millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millennia, into an increasingly conscious and then increasingly meta-aware, meta-capable orientation towards and therefore effectiveness in this pure domain. And each step in that direction becomes more and more leveraged, becomes more and more effective. And so somewhere in that period of the late 60s and early 70s, as we began to transition into the information technology age in all domains, right? We did it in academia with computer science. We did it with the transistor. We did it with the movement from analog to digital. We did it with the movement from traditional entrepreneurship to technology entrepreneurship. We have moved across a threshold where the effectiveness, the leverage, the accelerating returns of anti-rivalrous efforts has begun to be the only viable strategy. And this is good because, all right, so let me now drop this back into historical context. We've actually known for a very long time. We actually found, oddly enough, we have a nice parable. Give a man a fish and he eats for a day. Teach a man to fish and he eats forever. That's the same story. Teach a man to fish is anti-rivalrous in the sense that you don't lose anything. The person you've taught now has the capacity to feed themselves. And also, by the way, they have the capacity to teach other people how to fish. We know that it's human labor is able to be somewhat effective, but if you innovate the cotton gin, if you innovate the spinning wheel, if you innovate the steam engine, something else happens, right? So this wasn't obvious. Like we went for frickin' ever using just human slave labor and hand tools trying to in agriculture in the classical age, and then finally figured out how to build tools that could harness animal power to do agriculture. And so it wasn't sort of clear. It was not obvious that we should just sort of sit down, think hard about the problem, engineer the solution, and then it would give us a massive upregulation. But it's happened enough that it moved from accident to practice to finally science. And so now that we're in the science stage, our capacity to deliver on enormous leverage that generates actual abundance in the rivalrous domain is the precipice that we're at.
Right. And so you said this, or you kind of framed it like now we're becoming, as you say, meta-conscious of this sort of anti-rivalrous possibility and the incredible leverage that it can offer us if we take advantage of its affordances. And so, there's one thing I want to hear your thoughts on is like, so you can look at companies like Facebook or Google as having come to power on top of what are essentially seemingly anti-rivalrous products or applications. And yet now they've become the kind of agents within the ecosystem that seem to have consolidated all the power around them, such that there's not really space for any rivalry in a way that doesn't seem very generative. And then we also have, it seems, other things happening that are kind of coming and emerging out of the crypto world that are sort of attempting to threaten these agents who have consolidated their power because they better understand the nature of anti-rivalrous dynamics. So like there's this quality of ownership, right? That's kind of in the mix here around like, are we looking, if any agent who can better master the anti-rivalrous game is going to be exponentially more successful than those that can't. Is that heading us into necessarily a kind of like ownerless and decentralized future by its very kind of formulation? Or is that not quite seeing it right? Or how do you think of that sort of tension?
I actually felt like a pretty good way of saying it. I don't believe that it's necessarily. I think that there's many different possible ways this thing might play out. But this game, and we could just maybe characterize it, we can say there's one game, Game A, which is the game that we've been playing for a very long time, the rivalrous game. And there's another game, Game B, which is this anti-rivalrous game. And I think it's nice to actually characterize them as games because it gives us a sense of choice. It's not the case that the way that we go about doing civilization is somehow physics. It's not law of nature. It's a response. It's a set of choices that we make in the context of what we can do and what we must do. And so up until middle of the 20th century, maybe even the end of the 20th century, the Game A was in fact actually obligate. And the reality is that the capacity to begin to play in a new way, play this anti-rivalrous Game B, wasn't enough. It wouldn't get us. It wouldn't feed everybody. It couldn't deal with the challenges of maintaining this giant population in relative peace and relative plenty that had been delivered in the context of something that was dominated by Game A. But there's an important thing to keep into mind, and that's that some pretty long time ago, I don't know exactly how long, but maybe even as long as the dawn of civilization, it was perceived by what we might call the stewards of Game A that there was something intensely powerful in the innovators of Game B. Mm-hmm. So there's been a dynamic relationship forever. And you might say that the primary thing that Game A has been able to do is kind of twofold. The first is it's been able to turn anti-rivalrous innovation into a sort of captured resource, almost like an ant colony harvesting aphids, where enough innovation to generate competitive advantage against other game A players, right? Whether Google versus Apple or Rome versus Parthia, enough innovation to continue to increase the wealth of our particular civilization, but always in a context that is fundamentally characterized by game A rules, and which therefore means dominated by game A players. And so we can see this in the context of Facebook, right? Facebook is very, very much tapped into, or was, in its inception, in its origin, the innovative power, the disruptive capacity, the generative capacity of playing in a anti-rivalrous game B style. But still fundamentally playing it seated in and from game A, right? With the idea, for example, of Zuckerberg and a handful of other people fundamentally owning and controlling the generativity and the output of this multi-billion person meta collaboration on a communications protocol. And that's kind of like, I think, where we are, which is why the blockchain space is so interesting. If you run the clock back, I think there really was something very important happened in World War II, which that was the first time that in real time, during the waging of the war, there was an embodied visceral noticing of how technological innovation was decisive, right? Whether you're looking at Turing's work in computation being able to break codes and therefore possibly decisively advantage the Allies in the war, or you're looking at the Manhattan Project and the ability to take physics all the way to blowing things up in world historic magnitudes. You went from one state to another state in a time frame that was relatively obvious and massively asymmetric. And everybody at the end of World War II could have independently conquered the world in 1938. And so I think this shifted into the consciousness of all primary game A decision makers, leaders of business, military, science, etc., that this innovative capacity of science and technology was the thing. The only thing that mattered was harnessing that. And again, with an interesting balance. On the one hand, we need to have our scientists get us to the moon faster than their scientists. So there's a competition between the game A players, rivalrous competition between the game A players. And on the other hand, we want to use this wondrous power of science and technology to create generous, massive wealth inside our own economy, but always still within a framework that is fundamentally anchored in deeply rivalrous conceptions and notions. Let's use intellectual property as an example. I think it's a really great device, because what we've already identified, that things of the intellect, say like, I don't know, calculus, are anti-rivalrous, like some of the most powerful anti-rivalrous things out there, ideas. And yet, and this is not a notion of fault or duplicity, in a game that is designed to be rivalrous, there's not a very good way to deal with those things. We don't have a way to actually motivate, incentivize, reward, or even orient towards highest purpose the generation of anti-rivalrous things on their own basis. So what we have to do is we have to wrap them in a rivalrous container and treat them as if they are barrels of oil. And then we can plug them into a machine that's been designed through historical process for 15,000 years to be able to take these barrels of oil and make them economic objects. Right? So that's what patents and copyright is for. It converts anti-rivalrous things into pseudo-rivalrous things so they can actually they make sense in an economy fundamentally developed and designed around rivalrous. And so my proposition, my perspective is that we're now reaching the end of that dynamic. We're reaching a point where the friction is the game rules itself. The boundary conditions, the capabilities, the limitations, the constraints that are effectively intrinsic to how we go about playing game A, about how we go about playing rivalrous games, are the thing that is subject to disruption, the thing that is where the opportunity lies to be more generative, to be more productive. And so this then brings us to places like the furthest edges of the blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just there's a beautiful symmetry here with those who are aware of the kind of meta-modern politics movements with this idea of out-competing capitalism. So I just want to kind of flag that as a symmetry between what you're saying and what I hear coming out of that kind of subculture around, creating context where we can demonstrate the fact that in very real ways, basically people who are organizing in a, let's say, game B way are just going to be more productive, more creative, more generative than people who aren't. And that once that equation starts to shift, then, I mean, in a way, it's game A over, it seems.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool. And so, yeah, go on.
I think that's so. Like, think about it in terms of, say, Google and Apple. Google and Apple both represent boundary conditions, where inside Google, the intent is to play as close to game B as you can get. You want to take people and you want to put people in a context where they have their needs very well met. That they have food, high quality, nutritious food served to them for free. They have buses that take them from where they live to where they work, so they don't have to worry about any of those issues. They have in-house mindfulness classes. They have whatever, right? The idea is to make abundance felt and to bring these people into circumstances where they can fully gift their individual genius into the whole. And this is non-trivial. Even at a logistics level, the building up of the Googleplex software platform that makes it possible for a developer in Slovenia to find out that developers in Miami have actually written the code she needs to do her project, right? Being able to actually share and find this stuff is a real hard problem. But inside the envelope of Google, the effort is to make it as anti-rivalrous as game B as possible. And this is actually really good, crucial learnings. If you look at the arc, say, of technology companies, their internal culture has progressively moved in this direction. We moved from, say, Ford to General Motors to, I don't know, say IBM, Hewlett Packard, Microsoft, Apple, let's say like Yahoo, and then Google, right? Where in each case, there's actually an awareness that the culture continued to shift into a direction that is more and more and more like what we would call a generative game B culture. However, as in between the two, they're still interfacing with each other through game A. And so they still are fundamentally rivalrous. Now, remember this rule of the anti-rivalrous, which is that the more shared it is, the more valuable it is for everyone. What this means is that the larger the circle, the larger the interiority, you get an exponential generativity. So to give you an example, imagine that somebody working on the Apple self-driving car project has a deep innovation. And let's say Google is working on their self-driving car project and they don't have this deep innovation. Well, obviously, if that could be shared between the two easily, it could be made visible and shared, this would be very generative. Right? It would make the whole project move forward enormously, possibly decisively. But because they can't.
Well, what really struck me is I think Daniel Schmachtenberger say, the best phone that we're capable of making right now, we can't make because some of the IP is in Apple, some of the IP is in Google, some of the IP, and just that like completely shifted my perspective. Like, oh, wow, like we are actually kind of hamstringing ourselves as far as what we're capable of producing as a human community. And
that's a good concrete example because it's easy to see, right? It's not necessarily obvious to everybody, but if all you have to do is look at it a little bit closely, like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Like we've got these exclusive territories that we have to have under the ways that we go about solving basic problems of giving people access to the means of existence, i.e., how you get paid, which keep these ideas separated. But if these ideas were able to be shared, they would be substantially more generative. And this is not just one example. If you think about it not as the idea, but of the person who has the idea, which is where the power comes, right? It's the innovator. If the innovators can collaborate, there are inventions that have not happened just because a particular conversation hasn't happened. And let's go to the next level. Are you familiar with a mathematician named Ramanujan? So he's pretty legendary in mathematical circles. He was early 20th century India, and he's an Indian. And he was not connected to the imperial, the British academic. He didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. He was a self-taught guy, and more or less should have been completely unheard from. He was, I think, trying to get into the Indian civil service when somehow a connection happened where he was able to get a paper sent up to Oxford. Now, as it turns out, he's one of the singular geniuses in the history of mathematics. There's still stuff that people are puzzling over today that he was able to just think up on his own out of the blue. Well, the point is that there may have been 15 other Ramanujans that were just lost because circumstances didn't find them. Well, okay, great. Well, the leverage of that is incomprehensible. Right? The leverage of an Einstein or a Ramanujan is ginormous. And so an economy that is oriented around finding these people and maximally resourcing them in all ways, meaning help them process traumas so that they are no longer limiting their capacity to collaborate with other people and share their ideas effectively and openly. Help them become aware of how their own cognitive models might actually limit their capacity to be considering reality clearly. Like fill in the blank. There's lots and lots. Or help them solve just nutritional deficiencies. And there's just bajillions of ways you might want to go about resourcing these people. You might actually be able to have 100 Ramanujans that you would never have had, maybe 1,000, maybe 10,000. It's a big world out there. Much bigger now than it was in 1910. And almost all of them are, in fact, actually connected to a communications network that in principle has the possibility of finding them and then beginning some process of bringing them into relationship with each other and allowing them to begin to share. Now, think about that in the context of what might happen in something like the blockchain, where there aren't any preconceived notions that you shouldn't do that. If you were to imagine a structure, and this has kind of been figured out a little bit. It hasn't been figured out perfectly, but things like Ethereum and Bitcoin, and of course DAOstack is very much focused on trying to crack the code deeply on this, but ways of enabling individuals to come into very open collaboration with each other because there's a commons that is able to be the place where the value of the innovation goes, and there's a way that people can be rewarded for their generativity without the generativity having to be closed, without it having to be wrapped up in a container, hidden or restricted.
Right.
Like that's the core problem. And we're beginning to see just the largesse of small innovations in that direction. Again, like what we're seeing in decentralized autonomous organizations like Bitcoin and Ethereum, continuing to move us down that path. And as far as I can tell, this core question, like the basic problem of how do we make a comprehensive systems architecture in a pure game B way, is now front and center. Like there are now people who are actively trying to figure out how to solve pieces of that problem. And so then, as you say, to the degree to which that is resolved, and it may be impossible, there may be some sort of characteristic that just can't be solved, but to the degree that it is, that we figure out how to merely make it possible for people to fully gift their highest capacities into some commons, which is fully shareable, and that they can live a good life in that context. that is a that is a game changer. Right?
Yes.
That's a pivot point, because everyone will choose to live in that commons, because that commons will be maximally, unspeakably generative. And of course, that generates abundance. You want flying cars and food in pill form.
Yes.
That's the place where it's going to come from.
Yeah, and it seems like we're seeing kind of pseudo forms of that already within the blockchain community, just beginning to emerge, but yet they don't really feel quite refined yet. Like they haven't. It seems like there's a lot of talk in this direction, and yet I don't see the actual unfolding of a kind of symphony of human efforts towards a common purpose in the way that I'm at least imagining based on our conversation it will kind of look like. Yeah.
Well, interesting enough, I was just literally the conversation I was having before this, we were talking about that. And it seems that there's almost like a natural history of these kinds of places. And I'm going to call it a scenius, which is, I'm now shifting to a different language, but I'm sorry, it just occurs to me to be the best one. So the idea was coined by Brian Eno. It's the idea of a genius of a scene. So this can now describe a wide variety of different things, like say the emergence of punk rock, or the emergence of quantum mechanics, or the emergence of impressionism, or the emergence of fill in the blank. Right? It's a thing that sort of wants to happen, that sensitive creative types happen to be attracted to it before it's even named. They begin to create it by collaborating in it, or giving something to it that begins to become more and more real. And then at a certain point, it becomes known and becomes a movement, and then it grows. Right? So that's a scenius. And it seems that the scenius sort of has a natural ecology, or at least it has thus far had a natural ecology, which is that in the beginning, you have your creatives, your pure, sensitive artist types. Let's go with Vitalik Buterin as being of that sort in the blockchain space. People who are Ramanujan's, right? They're massively generative. But then you've got two other types. You've got your, what would we call these? I kind of want to call them pimps. And then you've got your con men, right? So you've got these exploiter types who see and for particular reasons happen to be risk-seeking enough that they're willing to go into things that are new and not well understood, and are very good at social skills, either by virtue of being pimps, which is to say that they use kind of anger, threat, and greed, or they're con men. But they're very good at social skills, and they interface and surround the creatives, and they begin the process of maximally exploiting the generativity of the territory. And of course, we see this, like say, look at rock and roll. You've got Jim Morrison or and David Bowie sort of emerge as these glowing lights of creativity and generativity, and you inevitably find them surrounded by a whole bunch of parasites. And those parasites actually end up defining the shape of the scenius, the shape of the environment, for quite some time. And then you've got your bureaucrats. Right? The bureaucrats come in, and they have the positive effect of stamping out a lot of the parasites. And they kind of normalize the space. They convert the Wild West into something much less wild, into Denver. But they have the negative consequence of applying game A architectures, whatever the current state of the art of game A happens to be, on top of this generative environment. Right? So they turn the explosive possibility of the personal computer revolution, the Steve Jobs, Bill Gates energy, into the PC industry. They turn the Tim Berners-Lee wild-eyed innovation of the World Wide Web into internet businesses, right? That kind of thing, which we're all familiar with. And again, it has the advantage of harnessing, of one, policing. So it squeezes out the parasites to some extent. It obviously also replicates them in a different layer. And it harnesses this potential energy, but it harnesses it in a way that shuts down its generativity. And part of that's conscious, right? It's a game A rivalry. I need to hold my cards close to my vest and keep this energy close to me. And part of it is just the tools that we've built to do this job, the kinds of engines of generativity that we have access to, aren't actually very well designed for a game B style environment, right? And so that's kind of the story. So when I look at what's been going on in the blockchain space, lo and behold, that's what's been happening, right? So we're somewhere in the parasite phase, right? We're in the phase where it's very Wild West, and where the sociopaths and the con men have stepped in and have sucked up a lot of the energy. Like if you want to do an ICO right now, it's actually very difficult to do so without playing with people who are douchebags. And we might imagine that at some point the bureaucrats will step in, right? And they will begin the process of virtuously displacing the douchebags and from a vice perspective, squeezing out the innovation.
Yeah, kind of breaking up the party. And I mean, that's already to a certain degree happening. Like the SEC has made moves to regulate at least the currency aspect of what the blockchain industry represents, which, is not the full picture, right? Especially as we talk about these kinds of game B systems. Right. They're moving beyond currencies to something that how will game A interface with things like DAO Stack? That's a ways away. So we haven't gotten to that point yet.
Right. So then remember the hypothesis, and this is just a hypothesis, that there's something about this accelerating innovation curve, that the pace of innovation is not just going apace, but is actually accelerating. And so the speed at which we might expect the next wave of generativity, the next wave of anti-rivalrous breakthroughs to show up is much faster than the speed of the current generation of bureaucrats. And so while the SEC is certainly stepping in, it's almost certainly, this is going to be actually quite interesting, it's almost certainly going to be the case that by the time they have figured out how to do anything at all, the entire party will have moved to something new.
Right.
It may even be not easily characterized as blockchain. I mean, this is one of the problems with exponential growth curves, is it's actually rather hard to predict. But certainly something new and different enough that the mechanisms, the techniques, the ability to articulate rules and structures and processes will likely have fallen behind already. And so at a minimum, there's going to need to be some sort of meaningful innovation in the bureaucracy tech just to keep pace with the innovation tech. But my hope is that will come from the generators and the innovators themselves in the form of finding new ways to do this game B thing, which is intrinsically resilient to parasites, which by its nature, by its design, just doesn't fall prey to the same cyclical trap.
Yeah, totally. And I think we're already seeing that as a movement. There's Materium. Vinay Gupta's company seems to be trying to sketch out that territory. EOS has their kind of own legal system. There's other, like Aragon also, I think, is experimenting with some kind of adjudication system within the space. And so it does seem like that's an emergent property of these generative systems. Like they are becoming aware that that's a necessity in order to kind of let the party continue in a way that is sustainable. So it's really interesting to watch this unfold. And I'm curious, Jordan, you also have this conception of a self-organizing collective intelligence. If we could kind of like bridge a little bit into that, because I think that's really fascinating. I had a conversation on the podcast recently about how maybe we can understand things like Occupy Wall Street as a kind of self-organizing collective intelligence, right? That may or may not have done a very good job, but still was kind of gesturing in that direction, a new kind of scaffolding and operating system for collective human expression such that it could make a dent in the world somehow. And you point out that maybe we're perhaps moving into the age of these kinds of self-organizing collective intelligence. And so first of all, like, or I guess good to ask, like, what is the relationship between these emerging game B structures and the possibility and emergence of self-organizing collective intelligences?
Okay, well, that's a pretty profoundly deep question. Okay, so let me begin with a framework that I think helps place that question. The word collective intelligence. So we have a simple notion of intelligence. Right? You have intelligence and I have intelligence. And then it's simple enough to say, okay, well, there's a way for us to enter into some kind of relationship whereby our intelligence is somehow collective, that there's something going on in the union of us interacting with each other that is different and ideally better than us operating on our own. Right? So that's the first piece. It's just the notion that collective intelligence exists.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing is that in the historical record, we seem to have about 4 different ways that we've been able to organize collective intelligence. The first is the thing that makes us human. And I'm actually going to call this the Dunbar collective intelligence with reference to the notion of the Dunbar limit. The hypothesis that I have is that there was an evolutionary selection event for a way to coordinate Homo sapiens into collective intelligence that was able to avoid the various pitfalls that show up in a collective intelligence, most notably things like defection. And that the Dunbar limit is a representation of kind of like a hardwired system for being able to do that, right? So in small groups, most notably small, close-knit, genetically related groups, we have a capacity to coordinate and avoid prisoners' dilemmas. We avoid bad Nash equilibrium. We have ways to police defections, for example. And there's lots of good literature on exactly how this shows up. But the bottom line is it's an ambient thing that evolution gifted us with that gave rise to what we are. Right? We are, in fact, the animal that forms very high quality collective intelligence. But it has a limit. Right? The hardware doesn't scale past about 150 people. And that's 150 people where every single person grew up in the same tribe with everybody else growing up in the same tribe, right? So no strangers at all. In a contemporary environment, maybe it's 10 or 4, but we can do it, right? We can use communication, reading body language, all kinds of stuff that is hardwired in the body to form a generative collective intelligence in relatively small groups. And I'm reasonably confident that this is the basic explanation for why startup companies are so famously effective. That the ambient creativity of truly collective intelligence has that Metcalfe's law exponent on intelligence, so that 10 people who are really working tribally in the positive sense, like working together as a shared collective intelligence, are 100 times or 1,000 times or 10,000 times more generative than they would be working alone. And then the problem is it doesn't scale. As you start getting into the order of 30, 40, 50 people, it starts to fall apart. You start getting confusion, you start getting communication gaps, you start getting little mini fiefdoms and sub-tribes start breaking off, you get defection, all kinds of things start to fall apart. And so that we transition into the next kind of coordination for collective intelligence, which is hierarchy, formal hierarchy.
Right.
And I don't want to spend a lot of time going into it, but we all know what it looks like, right?
Yeah,
it looks like corporations, it looks like militaries, it looks like states. And these work, right? These actually have the benefit of being able to scale much, much larger than 150 people while still maintaining some positive level of collective intelligence, that 10,000 people in a corporation are, in fact, more effective than 9,000 people in a corporation. But the hierarchies have, I guess, 2 characteristics that end up being problematic. One is their sense-making and intelligence scales relatively poorly. It turns out that the actual sense-making and core intelligence capabilities doesn't actually extend a whole lot more than some tribal level group. Right? The executive suite does most of the primary sense-making and core intelligence. There's still a lot that's done at the edge, but that's what do I say it? It doesn't contribute enormously to the deep thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so most of the effectiveness of these kinds of bureaucratic institutions is in actuation, is in doing, right? So you can think of Tesla as an organization as being largely like a power armor suit around Elon Musk,
right.
where it massively increases its actuation capacity.
Right.
And it meaningfully increases his intelligence capacity and his sense-making capacity, but not as much, like asymmetrically. And it actually has some kind of asymptotic curve that, when you've added the 10,000th to the 1,500th person, the 1,501st person is only incrementally better, and not exponentially better, and probably not even linearly better. You probably actually have less than one person value. But because the actuation capacity is so large, we still continue to grow these organizations. So, Alphabet or Google at an intelligence level would actually likely be vastly more effective broken up into, say, 1,000 smaller organizations.
Right.
But at an actuation capacity level, still is able to hold all that capacity, all those people inside its envelope. And this, I guess, is a way of really talking about the limiting factor of how our current crop of things that try to have a game be interior, where they continue to fail, because they're still running fundamentally on some kind of hierarchical structure.
Right. And it also, I think, speaks to, and we don't have to get into this yet, but the kind of breakdown in sense making that's occurring with some of the major institutions of our world who just can't figure out what to do or say in light of an increasingly complex world that demands more complex sense making.
Yeah, well, this is something that I was writing about in the context of something called the Blue Church, which is that it appears there's, in fact, actually just an upper limit of the total amount of sense-making that can happen in any kind of bureaucracy, that there's a compression that has to happen. So I've got people down on the ground, like in the field, looking at stuff, and they have a huge amount of information flowing up to them, and they have to report it up the chain. Well, they can only report up the chain some tiny, tiny fraction of what they actually perceive. So they're doing their local sense making, trying to identify what's relevant and what's not relevant and how to convey it effectively. And you've got a lot of compression, you've got a lot of lossiness, you've got a lot of errors get put into that. And as you go up the hierarchical chain, the stuff that's actually coming up to the decision makers at the top of the chain is damn near noise, right? It's this tiny, tiny amount of actual signal coming out of that massive bureaucracy. Right. And so it appears that there's actually a fundamental limit of the amount of complexity that just can be perceived and processed by a bureaucracy, depending on how many steps down the chain there happen to be, and where our world is now past that limit. So even what was it? What was his name? Werner von Braun. His NASA team that got us to the moon. Mm-hmm. That was a really well-functioning hierarchy, a really well-functioning bureaucracy. So let's just use that as an example of something that's very high collective intelligence of a group. Even they would be completely incapable of dealing with the level of complexity of the 21st century world. The complexity is just too high for any kind of bureaucracy, no matter how effectively, how well run, and how smart the people are in it. So that's a problem. There's lots of other problems too. There's ways that these things always fail. They become sclerotic. They become captured. Like there's 10 different characteristics. And then we can kind of skip to the next one. The next one is markets. And markets have a way of processing complexity that is actually scalable and very efficient. So there's things that markets can do that resolve a lot of the problems of bureaucracies, which is why we always kind of find these two functions working together. Mm-hmm. But equally, we can identify what the failure conditions of markets are, where the limits, the actual collective intelligence of markets is relatively small. The sense making is quite high, and the actuation, of course, is enormous. But there's only so many we actually have to hand off. Like the electric car doesn't ambiently get discovered by the market. There has to be some kind of hierarchy that comes together and pushes that intelligence over a certain limit and then brings that back into the market. So there's a dynamic between bureaucracies and markets that allows the collective intelligence of civilization to be able to maneuver. And then, of course, there's other major problems. The most notable problem of markets is that they're subject to multipolar dilemmas, multipolar traps, various prisoners' dilemmas and things like that cannot be resolved across non-trusted exchanges. This is the Apple Google non-coordination problem.
Mm.
So then we've got the fourth. The fourth is this thing that I had previously called CNES, and we can also call self-organizing collective intelligence. And the distinction for me has to do with the technical infrastructure that enables it to be self-organizing. So anytime that you have an ability to communicate and to share intellectual expression and share expressions, you have the basis for some kind of self-organizing collective intelligence. So punk rock. There was a sense of something that was living in the ambient environment of rock and roll at the time that started showing up as a form of expression that was able to be perceived by certain people, and they were able to perceive it as being more in alignment with punk rock than otherwise. And then they were able to take that signal, process it themselves, and then output a new expression that was even more towards the essence of what this thing was, right? And so you began a process of a communication ping act, like a signal, like a bat signal. It was a very vague bat signal initially. But if you could see it, for those with ears to hear and eyes to see and hands to do, it began to make sense of itself. And that's kind of the essence of it, is that there's almost like a higher order beingness of these things, where there's something that wants to happen. And then there's people who are able to perceive that thing that wants to happen. And then they're able to give body to it. They're able to give expression to it, voice to it, to make it more fully perceivable by more people. And that begins a feedback loop process that brings it more and more and more into being.
Right. But then there's an upper limit so far in terms of the way that we design collectives, in terms of how many people can participate in that emergence. Is that?
That's right.
Okay.
In lots of ways. There's the way that the generativity, the energy inside the emergence gets siphoned off and or used. So using punk rock as an example, you have to sell out to some extent if you want to be able to make a living as a punk rock star, which means that you have to defect from the essence of the thing that you're doing. There's a reason why selling out exists as a concept.
Right.
And this is true in general, right? Right. So far, we have limits around how do the people who are participating in the self-organizing collective intelligence fully orient themselves towards the essence of that which wants to be, as opposed to some extent, exploit it for the purposes of, at a minimum, giving rise to their ability to participate. How do they feed themselves? You have communications. Like, how do you actually get everybody who is able to perceive this and should be participating in it, able to perceive it and being able to participate in it? You've got curation. How do you most effectively separate the signal from the noise so that the signal comes through very clearly and the noise is rapidly evaporated out? There's a whole bunch of stuff. And so what's happening is that the current generation of self-organizing collective intelligences have access to a whole new set of communications technologies. So, for example, the blockchain that has the ability to ratchet up a lot of these questions, resolve a lot of these problems. Like the notion of magic internet money is a big fucking deal. Like the idea that, we don't have to quote unquote make money anymore. We're now in the business of making money up. And so now that's a huge flip, because now what can happen is I can just do the thing, and I don't actually have to think about how do I then market it and monetize it in, say, US dollars. I can simply, if it's valuable, then people will come and grab its token, and it begins to self-perpetuate. Maybe, right? This is kind of, we're moving into that place. Certainly with things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, we had something of that sort, and people begin to be paid just in ETH and feel good about it, and are able to contribute themselves fully, because now they're fully aligned with this thing, as opposed to being partially aligned or even non-aligned, potentially exploiting it.
So I do really appreciate everything you've been presenting on self-organizing collective intelligences and rivalrous and anti-rivalrous dynamics. I think with regards to what you've just been talking about, it would be helpful to ground our understanding perhaps in an event that is happening right now and that is kind of pointing, I think, towards some of the futures that you're talking about might be imminent and certainly somewhere down the line. And that example is QAnon. And you wrote an article recently about QAnon as a self-organizing collective intelligence, which certainly is not a frame you see in most media outlets. In fact, I think you're the only person I've seen frame it that way. I think I might have seen members of the Rally Point Alpha Facebook group that exists on the internet mention this kind of analysis or this kind of frame. But could you unpack for listeners, like, how is it that we can understand QAnon as a self-organizing collective intelligence, and why might it be helpful to take on that frame to look at it?
Wow, good golly. So before we go there, let me just contextualize a little bit. You mentioned, I think, nosebleed. So I think it's ultimately helpful to notice that we've been going down one particular rabbit hole with a couple of rabbit warren branches, and I tell you that in fact it keeps going. It goes a lot deeper than we've been going through so far, and that's a lot. And then the second thing is that I'd say there's somewhere between 25 and 150 other equally deep rabbit holes that are also going on and are that deep. And then, of course, you've got the whole sort of what happens when they interact with each other. So a certain, what would you say? I don't know, maybe humility or a certain spaciousness with regard to the complexity that we're dealing with, I found is really the only way to go into it. And just accept the fact that this is a big, hard thing. And yet it's not a big, hard thing that you can kind of like say, it's like physics that I just don't want to take the class in college. It's actually reality. It's the reality we're living in. And most of it's just happening. You don't necessarily have to understand it, but there's some degree to which you can. And it's okay that it's big and hard and there's lots, and just sort of take it at a pace that feels reasonable. And don't feel too bad about it because it's enormous. And I don't know a single person who is currently holding a meaningfully large fraction of all of these rabbit holes together.
Yeah, hence the need for self-organizing collective intelligences, right?
Exactly. That is kind of the end game, right? That's the whole point. So, in the case of QAnon, there's actually a whole bunch of different things that are happening, and we have to be careful not to confuse them. So, I would advise in this case a sort of clinical approach. Imagine that it had happened 1,000 years ago in ancient Greece, and so you do not care about the specifics of the players who are involved and what they're doing with each other. You really have to get that out of your head if you want to be able to look at it. And there's about 4 or 5 actually very fascinating phenomena that are going on inside this thing, not the least of which is one of the things I called out in my essay having to do with the change in the nature of how mind itself works, that also have to be partitioned out. Right? So we're looking at just the self-organizing collective intelligence sub-piece of this problem. And in this case, at least to my mind, at least, it's actually pretty simple. Let's take a look at it. With QAnon, well, let me just back up. So there's a thing that happened in sort of October of 2016, where somebody, it is not currently known who, there are many people who claim it's them, began the process of posting anonymously on a place called 4chan, which I'm not going to explain. It's like a big, crazy message board. And it has the ability to be completely anonymous. Questions, like Socratic-style questions that were sort of in the vague conspiracy theory and or contemporary politics domain. And this little individual or group of individuals posting anonymous questions to an anonymous message board deep in the dark web has grown to being a somewhat gigantic movement. I mean, on the order of maybe millions of people, maybe even more on a global basis, are pretty actively at least following, and a pretty large number of people are actively participating. So we're looking at it as something where there isn't a bureaucracy, right? There's no structure that you can join to become a member of Q. There's no sign-up sheet. There's no HR department. There's no CEO. There is a centerpiece. Right? There is a one or more, and questionably, it may in fact have changed over time. Questioners who are Q, right? They have a centerpiece of agency, right. A little bit like Satoshi in Bitcoin. Of course, Satoshi went away, but there was a point in time when Satoshi was present. So you might call this Q as sort of very first among equals. But Q, up until relatively recently, operated almost entirely by asking questions, which has a very interesting characteristic, which is that it generated a lot of openness. Like a question opens much more space than it closes. And the amount of space that has been opened inside the territory of Q, the QAnon, like the larger community of people, is really rather enormous. The amount of questions that they have asked and the number of potential answers that they have produced is Wikipedia-esque in magnitude. And it's entirely decentralized. In fact, in many cases, it's largely even anonymous and decentralized. So people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, are going about digging into WikiLeaks and digging into Wikipedia and digging into the logs of aircrafts that are flying around the world, into old YouTube videos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And on their own are trying to make sense of them in the context of a larger sense-making project that is the whole QAnon phenomenon, and then are contributing the information, the raw data, and their own sense-making into a highly decentralized set of locations. So some large number of forums, message boards, subreddits, YouTube channels, Twitter feeds, that these people are showing up and having conversations, and you'll see, like, somebody will post an idea, a piece of information or a piece of sense making that they've done in one location, and sometimes this will just spread. It'll spread flowing throughout all the different locations. It will become kind of common knowledge. It'll become stitched into the common knowledge. There's a particular object, for example, called the Q clock that was largely cobbled together by one or two people on 8chan, let's say about 6 months ago. And some group of people, who, by the way, in this subculture are called clock fags, because it comes from 4chan, and that's just part of their language, are somehow specialists in scrying the meaning of the Q clock. And then if they find something that seems meaningful, will then send that meaning out, and that will spread throughout the larger collective intelligence. And this is the key, right? This is the point. There's no notion of who's in charge, other than this one particular character Q who orients attention towards certain things by asking questions, and sometimes even double clicks attention by being able to, if somebody posts something and Q reposts it, that is like a stigmergetic signal that tells everybody to pay attention to that subpiece. But very rarely, if ever, does Q actually point at something and say, this is right, which is an interesting gambit if you think that it's either a LARP or a PSYOP to sort of never be pinned down. But whether that's the intent or not is irrelevant, because the effect it has is it continues to keep the inquiry space somewhat open, and in fact, quite often, rather open. And so I think it's very fair to say that the body of knowledge, the body of the model, so there's a model of sense, meaning increasingly believed axioms about what is true in the world, and increasingly believed axioms about epistemology, like how you go about making good sense, and what the implications of this sense are for the state of the world, and then what is likely to happen and what information is coming in means, right? So this is like your own internal cognitive model in your head that you use. Q has begun the process of building something similar to that, but it is fully decentralized. It is held in some kind of collective whole, and is very able to access an extremely large number of independent eyes, ears, hands to do things like perception and digging and research and analysis, and things are coming in somewhat willy-nilly, and then there's a mechanism that is evolving internal to itself for sorting and upregulating. Now, this is not to say that this is a particularly effective mechanism, right? It's like, I think I've compared it in my essay to like a toddler.
Yeah, the clock fags aren't exactly pushing forward innovative horizons of various parts of the human experiment.
Well, I mean, but it's funny because I've got a pretty good grasp of history. So I'm familiar with, for example, the work that John Dee was doing in the precursor to the birth of science. He was a British, well, actually, he in many ways gave rise to the concept of Britain, an English person in the Elizabethan era, who did work that was almost entirely in the domain of the supernatural and magic, and yet contributed quite significantly to empirical science. And it's likely we would not have empirical science if he hadn't been participating. And I'm familiar with the work that was being done by the original participants and members of the Royal Society. And most of it would look like really serious, terrible pseudoscience, if not outright magic to us, right? So it wasn't until you got to somewhere in the middle of the 19th century that you started getting something that looked kind of like what we think of as science out of this science, right? Out of this self-organizing collective intelligence that we know as science, modern science, as a way of making sense of reality. Right? Think about that. You had a process whereby decentralized individuals, experimenters all over Christendom, could do experiments. They could use printing press and increasingly sophisticated transport channels to share that to some extent. So somebody in the Netherlands could read reports of what experiments they had done in England. They could iterate, they could verify, they could share. And this began to knit together a new way of making sense of a certain level of complexity known as the natural world. And of course, it worked, right? And it sucked for a long time. And they came up with all kinds of crazy ideas that were completely wrong. But it had a process whereby it was interfacing with reality, both formally and practically, meaning that if you had a process for making gunpowder that either blew up prematurely or didn't blow up at all, you were not going to be very successful in the gunpowder industry. So the linkage between science and technology ended up being a big piece of what was the selection event that gave rise to that collective intelligence. Well, Q is kind of like that, right? Right now, it's in the very earliest stages, and but it's dealing with something very different. Right? It's not dealing with just natural reality. Nature has a really neat effect, which is that, as far as we can tell, boiling point of water is the same everywhere that's at the same altitude, regardless of what year it was done in. And as far as we can tell, applying energy to water will work in the same way everywhere. Right? There's a lot of really neat things about science in the context of nature. QAnon is trying to deal with what we might call socio-history. What actually has been happening in the world of people? Well, you can't replicate that. I can't do an experiment right now to find out what really happened inside Nixon's office in 1973. It's just history, right? I have to try to do my best to dig up old records and make sense of the partial records, almost all of which were already injected with huge amounts of manipulative noise. And so it's a signal processing effort of a completely different kind than science, and of orders of magnitude more complexity. And it's in the process of endeavoring to happen. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm describing what's going on here. No, it's happening in a current context, right? So it has a huge political aspect to it. And it's just barely beginning to emerge. So it seems very kind of clumsy and rough hewn. But from my perspective, we're seeing something which is fundamental, and we're seeing it in its earliest stages. And we have this amazing capacity to actually watch it develop in real time.
Yeah, and I think furthermore, given what we've talked about before, we talked about specifically QAnon, that it may be that we are inventing the kind of paper-like enabling technologies or suite of technologies that allow us to invoke these kinds of self-organizing collective intelligences with more and more skill and kind of capacity and with more flexibility. And so, I mean, it's kind of gobsmacking the potential of this way of making sense of it.
I think that's actually a perfect word for this. Yes. And then we could talk about the things that are probably going to need to happen. One of them, which was a big one, I talked about that in the essay, was the movement from a fundamental media and communications infrastructure dominated by broadcast television to one dominated by the digital internet. And the reason why this makes a big difference is that the digital internet has memory, whereas television does not. And increasingly high quality memory, which is to say both actually storing everything, so the base information can actually be recovered unedited, is fundamental, which by the way the blockchain will turn out to be perfect for. And then second, actual tools and mechanisms for having, call it a Bayesian or probabilistic awareness of confidence intervals. So we will never know for sure about lots and lots of things that happened in the past. But what we can do is we can have some sort of sense of how much confidence we have, and then an increasingly sophisticated probabilistic science for how to increase our confidence interval and how well we can base future conjectures based upon our current confidence interval.
Wow. Right. Which is actually how something like Watson, IBM's Watson.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
That's how something like IBM's Watson makes sense. You've got it. And so anyway, that's we can go down that rabbit hole for a long time, and maybe it's a subject of a different conversation. But as an example of the self-organizing collective intelligence, the fact that we have things like Twitter, the fact that we have things like message boards, and that these things have durability, meaning I can go back and look at stuff, and that they're global in nature, mediated by cell phones and the internet, are a big part of a completely new kind of physical layer, new kinds of communications infrastructure that enables these forms of self-organizing collective intelligences to happen globally, to happen hyper rapidly. And that's the novelty that we're talking about.
Nice. I mean, I feel like there was a lot that you said that made connections in different domains of my understanding. And I definitely will need to go lie down, I think, to let them settle into my body. And I appreciate you taking the time to kind of unfold, especially these two concepts, self-organizing collective intelligence and the rivalrous and anti-rivalrous, kind of together in the same space. I feel like they're so key, and in hearing them unfold together next to each other really deepened my understanding, I think, of both. And so I appreciate you for taking the time to do that.
You're welcome. I'm interested to see what might come of this.
Cool. Well, thank you, Jordan. It's great to have you back on the show.
All right, man. Bye.